So for our fantastic panel today talking about React Server Components, we've got Tom Preston-Werner. All right, Andrew Clark.
This one's for you.
Okay. Kathryn Middleton. Woo! Matt Carroll. Ben Holmes, that you just saw, and Josh Comeau. Hey, everybody.
Woo! All right.
Fantastic. Okay. So I'm going to do a combination of some stuff that we talked about beforehand, then get on to Slido, and hopefully answer a few questions there too. Got a lot of panelists, and not a lot of time to talk, but let's get into it. So, are RSCs something that every React developer should learn now?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely, 100%.
That's easy enough. More ideas? No, you want to dig down into that a little bit?
I can start. I feel like it's RSCs, like the fact that you get to use server components on the server or components on the server is insane. So like, you should learn how to use it. Like just in general, it's really cool to be able to use server components. And I think like if you're new to React or you're starting an application from scratch, totally check out RSCs. Like we are trying to incorporate RSCs as part of our Learn docs and incorporate it as the React paradigm. But if you are someone who is already have an application and wondering whether or not it makes sense to use RSCs, like I think it could help with a lot of use cases, especially if you're using like a lot of data or a lot of things on the server side. It's totally worth learning RSCs.
Does anyone disagree with it? I'm curious. On the panel?
The only thing I would say, I think if you have an existing application, you shouldn't feel like pressured to start converting it. Like, you know, like every component we've ever written until now has been a client component, and so there's no like big urgency. But I do agree that it's a really cool feature, and if I was starting a new application today, I definitely.
Right, but if I'm doing like a Create React app, not that you should start that today, but like or a Vite app, just completely spa. Is there anything that I'm going to get out of React Server Components, or is that just mostly when it's going to be like Next.js?
Well, it's really about having the possibility to choose from the best worlds of a multi-page app and a single-page app and combine them together. So it's about choice. So I think to not learn them is to be ignorant by choice. None of us want to be ignorant by choice, right? So learn them so that you know whether you want to use them or not, but at least learn what they're capable of.
I would also, do you want to go, Matt?
Yeah, I just got to say that when you're starting, if you start with server components, you can build a single page app. But if you don't start with a server component compatible framework, you cut yourself off from being able to leverage the server later on without having to do a very rough rewrite. So there's plenty of examples of people building complete client-side applications that just deploy to a CDN, building with a server component framework. And if they ever do decide to leverage the server, it's just one component. You might have some infrastructure you need to work with, but as far as the migration on the React side, you don't need to do anything.
I was going to add, I think there's an implied premise in that question, which is that server components are additional complexity to learn, especially if you're starting out. And I think that is true if you already have an app. If you already have an app, it is just an extra thing to put in your brain. It's an extra pattern to learn. It's just more knowledge, so more complexity.
More is more.
Yes.
But the idea, though, is, and I think for folks that are just getting started out, they're going to have an easier time, because what do you get to unlearn if you do have server components? I don't know if y'all are aware of server actions, but server actions is an example of something where if you use that pattern, maybe I don't ever have to write an API endpoint, you know? That's not that appealing to someone who already has a bunch of API endpoints, but if you kind of wipe the slate clean, I think there's an argument to be made that that's just way simpler.
Yeah. Is using React Server Components properly, is server actions part of that? In order to use RSCs properly, should you also be using server actions? Because they are somewhat controversial, but then RSCs were also controversial.
Very new.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think that they are necessary for the mutation side of things. If you don't know what that means, it's like React forever has been, you ship everything to the client, and if you want to fetch something, well, use query, I guess, because use effect is scary. And there hasn't really been an answer for, I need to go back to the server and get more stuff. And server actions is that answer to get more stuff. And it injects into forms really nicely. So if you just have a form set up, you can wire it to an action, and you can expect any submission to that form to go to your server. So it feels like the missing piece that React is needed when you want to treat it in a full stack kind of way. That use query and TRPC have filled up until now. And I've also learned you can use TRPC in a way to kind of bridge client fetches and server actions. So there's a lot of ways to kind of adopt into it. It is very new, though. I know it was experimental for a while, and there's some like closure things, bundlers, tainting object references. I feel like there's best practices to come out of the primitive that are still being worked on. But it feels like it's going the right way, having it in React Core especially.
Yeah, fantastic. And here's a Slido question. So be sure to put in Slido the questions you want answered and upvote the ones that you like. Doesn't streaming prevent server-side caching? And wouldn't it be better to be able to also use RSCs as a pure server-side rendering technology?
So by pure server-side, do they mean not streaming and trying to render it to HTML? Because I don't know what pure means.
Okay.
When it is being rendered from the server still. It's just streaming
Sure.
down the results as it goes. So, I don't know. Does anyone want to expand on that?
Yeah, I don't know if I 100% understand the question, but I'm going to pretend it means a certain thing. So, is streaming incompatible with caching?
Sure.
Because usually the thing that you cache is not a stream, it's going to be like the full buffered result.
Right.
I will at this point plug partial pre-rendering. And the idea behind partial pre-rendering is to get the benefits of both. This is an experimental next thing, but it's built on primitives that are in React. And so other frameworks could take advantage of the same pattern. And in partial pre-rendering, by the way, I invite you to just Google that term or go to partialprerendering.com to see the demo. But the idea is that you're going to cache as much as you possibly can throughout the server components tree until you hit something dynamic. And then when you visit the page, you're going to get the benefits of caching, where everything that was cached using essentially the ISR pattern, everything that was cached can be instantly delivered, the same way that you would instantly deliver a regular asset from the edge. And then simultaneously, in parallel, you can stream in the dynamic parts. And that's how you can get the benefits of both. And like Tom was saying, the idea with all of these API designs is you want to have as much as possible, you want to have like a single paradigm, a single architecture that allows you to very easily and in a compositional way take the advantage of these different benefits.
I think in the previous worlds, when you had to use SSR, or when you were using SSR, you had to choose at a pretty high level how you were going to think about your server-side rendering. And a lot of what server components let you do is bring that scope down from a route or a larger level down to the component level. And React gives us primitives to choose how we treat each individual component. So just like Next is doing with partial pre-rendering, there's nothing, React has the primitives to let you statically cache an individual component and send that HTML, and then for other dynamic components, you can use RSCs to update just the components that you need to. So React today has everything you need to do, I think, the best of both worlds when it comes to streaming and caching.
I'd also say that partial pre-rendering is really exciting. Like, it's been the gold standard of mine for a long time to figure out how to have the best of both of these worlds. Like, I wrote a blog post about hydration. And to avoid hydration mismatches for any sort of dynamic data, you sort of have to leave a hole in your application. Then you have to wait for React to hydrate on the client. You have to do a re-render. You have to fetch any data that you need. And all that takes a lot of time. So it is really cool, the idea that like the server can shoot away or even have a cached HTML file that includes all the generic stuff, but it's still working as you're downloading that HTML and React is getting set up, and you're just shooting along the dynamic data as soon as possible. So it does, like, it unlocks the sort of thing that years ago I sort of was yearning for. So I'm really excited about it.
All right, well, the audience has a fantastic question that I really want to ask y'all. So for a regular internal corporate app, do you think RSC is offering anything over, say, a SPA model?
I definitely do. So my whole argument is, and this is kind of what I was trying to get at earlier, is that RSCs are just way simpler. And it might take like a year or two or some time to convince everybody of this, but I don't think that building an app with one of these modern meta frameworks is harder than building an app with Create React App. I think it's easier. Again, server actions is just, I know there's some controversy, but if you give it a shot, I think, and keep an open mind, it's just way simpler than not using server actions. There's just so much less plumbing and so many fewer little bits that you got to stitch together to get something basic working. If this idea, if this vision of server components enabled apps being simpler than the old SPA style is not true today for everyone, then maybe we have some work to do. But I think that is the assertion, and that is the future we're trying to build toward.
I agree. The mental model of server components really is much simpler. If you think back to some traditional multi-page application kind of frameworks like Ruby on Rails, et cetera, it's very easy to think about how that works. You have a server, you fetch some data on the server, you produce a page and deliver HTML to the client, and that's kind of the whole thing there. And then you might layer some JavaScript on top. Well, React Server Components allow you to do the same thing, but now fully with React, choosing where your boundary between the server rendered and the client rendered functionality goes. But as far as data fetching, you can really, really simplify that model. And instead of having to fetch data over the wire and send that down or split it up, or if you're doing one single action in the very beginning to feed all that data into your component tree, just fetching the data on the server, putting it into a React Server component for display, you can do very simple things simply. And I think that should be a goal that we all have.
I don't think you should be looking at like general categories of projects and say server components are good for this or that. Like, you should look at the individual constraints of your project. Like, providing a broad recommendation for internal corporate apps is really hard. But if you already have an internal app that's working with Create React App and you don't have any problems with it, I don't feel like you need to use server components just to use server components. But if you're encountering some problems with bundle sizes or some latency making network requests from the client that would be better served making those requests from the server, that could be something to look at. Or if you're starting fresh, I do agree with everyone that this is the best place to start.
Can I give a counter argument to everything we just said? Which is, I think the biggest reason you would maybe not use server components today is you're not running JavaScript on the server. That is a realistic. I mean, a lot of folks they have Python apps, backends, they have Rails backends. If you can't run JavaScript on the server, then, well, maybe consider running JavaScript on the server. But if that's not an option, then look, don't feel like you're doing something awful by continuing to use Vite or one of these other classic methods of building a React app. But I do think, I had mentioned earlier that honestly, while I do think just running JavaScript on the server is like worth it to get all these other benefits, honestly, I am a little bit excited by the idea of someone building an RSC runtime for like Python or something like that. I think that'd be really cool, where you just write Python that sends down client React components, and everything else would be essentially the same. But that'd be cool if someone built that. I think someone built a Go version of this, right?
Yeah.
It was like an experiment, but.
Well, that's cool.
So yeah, I think that is a valid reason not to use server components. Is just it's a technical limitation. Another one is React Native doesn't have a server components implementation yet, so you still have to use traditional methods there. And then another one is that, you know, a lot of times I fall into this trap of describing like the idealized world where everything has adopted this pattern and all of the kind of concerns and features that we want to build have already been built. But another example that comes up a lot is like local first apps, where you don't have to do a server round trip every single time you want to navigate. Current frameworks don't make that possible, or at least easy. But maybe in like a year or two, that stuff will be built out. So it is important to like separate our idealized description of what we want the world to look like from what's actually been built today. But I do hope that people understand that even the parts that aren't there yet, we can make better on this architecture.
Also, RSCs are opt-in, so don't feel pressure to use RSCs. Client apps are not going away.
Yeah, and I noticed the like the way suspense and other patterns work are the same. So if you have like a client-side suspense app where you're querying and pushing things up, you can kind of turn it into a server component, expect it to work the same way. So it doesn't feel like a refactor needs to change the way your React code looks or the way it's structured. The only difference is now your root needs to be server-side, which is why it's harder to adopt later.
If I could just add one more point to that, which is, I meant to say this earlier, most of these features that we've talked about, like server actions, actually do have a client equivalent. So we haven't really talked about this so much in the docs and stuff, because one thing at a time, but the action API where you pass a function to a form, that works just in regular React. You pass a function and you do like some sort of mutation, it could be calling to an API endpoint, and that does work in React now. The idea is that, going back to this idea of single unified programming model, is that the same patterns that you use on the client are also used on the server, and as much as possible, vice versa. Obviously, you can't be doing a SQL injection in your action on the client, but the programming model should be the same. So we do really try, and we get heat for this sometimes too, we do try to make the same features available on the client as well, so that you have that unified model.
And the other important point is all those work and can be composed together. So you can have a client action that validates a form on the client, and then also have that call a server action that does further validation and actually performs whatever task you want. So that's one of the biggest benefits too with all these different primitives we have, is we've done a lot of work to make sure they work very well together.
Well, that's
all right.
cool. I had no idea.
Chris in the audience asks, and 16 people want us to also ask, when we say learn RSC today, do we really mean learn Next.js? And are there initiatives underway to help other frameworks thrive with the RSC RSA? Who will be next?
Well, I can say that we're working on RedwoodJS and incorporating React Server Components into RedwoodJS as an additional framework that you could choose if you want to choose React Server Components. So we're getting there. It's underway.
Yeah, we're talking. Yeah, I'm working with the Redwood team, and if anyone else is building a framework that wants help getting started building a framework, would love to help y'all out.
Yeah, I'm really rooting for all these other frameworks so I can stop having to answer that question.
All right, what is planned to make RSC's non-dependent, on Next.js, having a documented API to access the server and client parts? So, yeah.
I mean, a big part of how we're facing this at Redwood is, right now it is a little challenging. Like, things are not fully defined. But part of the work that we take upon ourselves is to help the React team, and Matt's been amazing at this, is to really unravel where those boundaries are, where they need to be better documented, so that everyone in the ecosystem and this community can understand those boundaries and kind of have a much more well-codified documentation. And we can all create implementations and push React and the future of React forward together. That, to me, is how we all win. No tool is going to be perfect for any job. The important part is that we have great tools that solve individual problems that you can apply when those problems are your problems. And we do that together as a community.
I think another lens to this is to consider how would you adopt server components if you're a company like Meta, or you're a company like Microsoft. You're not running Next or Redwood probably. You have, I can speak for Facebook because I used to work there, but incredibly sophisticated bundlers and infrastructure that is not the same as the off-the-shelf stuff that we use in the open source community. And Meta is in the process now, I believe, someone can correct me, of looking to start to integrate server components into their highly sophisticated, largely relay-based infrastructure today. And it should be possible for not just Meta, but for any other kind of corporate environment like that to adopt this technology. And so in addition to enabling the Redwoods of the world, that's another thing we have in mind is it is complicated. There's a reason there's not just like a 5-bullet point list of this is what you do, is because it does take some engineering work to build one of these things. It's like building, there's a reason why people don't just build their own Webpack every day, or they build their own, Vite every day. Like, I'm not going to say it's quite on that level, but it's complicated, it's complex, and it's not like a one-size-fits-all thing, as Tom was saying. So that is a goal for us, is to enable any organization with a little work to adopt the technology.
I mean, I think they could just watch Ben's talk.
We try.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah, I feel like the impetus for that kind of question is like, how can we get to the same thing that happened with server rendering, where I have an Express server, I need to add server rendering, show me what to do. Oh, it's rendered to string, I can add that. It's a lot more than just core React APIs, it's bundler APIs. It's how you actually bundle the whole thing out. Because up until now, React has been transpiled. You can turn JSX into function calls. That's easy enough to call Babel and do. But bundling a server component with a client component with the server child that has a server action, that requires even like cyclical bundling paths. I've talked with Vite way too much about this. Requires fundamental changes in how you think about bundling in order to support it. So I feel like to adopt it on a larger scale, it needs bundlers, Webpack and others, to have a system that is generic enough where you could call into it and say, I'm a company, we use raw Vite, we're going to toss a server component at it, and it has everything in order to bundle it out and gives us just what we need to plug it into an endpoint. It's a tough future to get to, and it requires a lot of motivation across frameworks for us to build it out so you can use it. So I'm glad Redwood's on that, because y'all use Vite. And
yeah, exactly.
like other teams use Vite too.
Vite does not currently do what we need it to do, but we hope that our efforts will make it easier for the independent businesses of the world to apply it in that way. It's like, oh, we'll just add this plugin and put your components here, and you're 90% of the way.
I will say that there's a lot more to Redwood and Next.js than just that part, though. And slightly spicy, I don't recommend most people try to build their own server components implementation.
What?
I would suggest you unless it's for fun, yes.
Unless you're
20
building.
minutes.
Great.
Unless you're
I'm not
done.
trying to. I mean, that's exactly the type of person I am. I want to take things apart. But if your focus is not so much having fun, but if you're building a product, or you're at this company and your main goal is to deliver value to your customers, it's probably usually not the right route to go and stitch together your own implementation. Is to use one of these pre-built frameworks, unless you're at some place like Meta, Amazon, Microsoft that has really sophisticated requirements. Which is not to say you shouldn't watch these talks and get really interested in it, but for most people, you should wait till the Vite plugin exists, or you should wait until these frameworks are adoptable and do that.
Since I've joined the React team, I think I focused a lot on what the React application developer experience is like with server components and server actions. And now with server actions being in the Canary release and used by Next and Redwood and hopefully many others coming soon, like I'm hearing a lot more from the community that we need to know how to build libraries. We need to know how to build frameworks. And Ben highlighted a few on his stream preparing for this talk, and we've been talking a little bit about that. So my focus moving forward is going to be a little bit more on how to connect folks that are working on all these things together and helping get them what they need to build libraries and frameworks.
And speaking of things that impact the community, and this is something that people are asking about, since server components are so new, how would you approach hiring and technical screening around them? A lot of folks want to know.
I mean, I don't know that technical screening should be so technology focused, right? Like a developer can learn the technology. So I don't, like in general, I find it's not like the best, like quiz you on the most bleeding edge React feature and use that as a basis for hiring. I don't know what.
Honestly, someone with no React experience at all is probably going to be a better server components developer than someone who has like 10 years building and create React app.
Yeah.
Yeah, hiring for technology people has never been just about how many years of experience do you have with technology X. To us, when I was hiring a lot at GitHub, it was really about finding people that were motivated. I mean, for us, the thing that we really sought were people that had made money on the internet before. Like that was the secret sauce to our hiring, right? Because it meant a person had this more cohesive set of things that they cared about. They cared about product, they cared about customers, customer service, they cared about performance, cohesively. To me, that's what you really want in a technical person. And years of experience with React Server Components is not one of those things. A person that understands React Server Components or understands web architecture in general can get up to speed on those things. You want a well-rounded developer. That's really what you want.
Yeah, at our interviews, we don't interview people to use React. It's all vanilla JavaScript. So it's more about just understanding web and the language of web and the architecture versus, do you know React? What about server components? So it's more just the principle of vanilla JavaScript and being an expert in that space.
That's it too. I think if you are a seasoned React developer, there's a lot that you already have in your toolkit to build with server components. All the ideas that we've built with server components are around the same primitives that we've built in React since the beginning, in composability. And yeah, there are some new things to learn, but I think if you hire a seasoned React developer, they're not going to have a hard time picking up server components.
Yeah, the real difference is now there's more back-end knowledge expected or being used because we've blended the paths so close together that they're the same thing now. So if you're just a React dev that knows how to sling style components or design systems, but you've never dealt with request response patterns, well, you're going to struggle with it, which is expected. So I feel like it's back-end experience that you need, platform experience with understanding how all of these things work together, what a stream is, and that should be kind of the basis. We were talking about Ruby on Rails and PHP. Like, those are parallels, too, if you're coming from those communities.
That's actually a great point because I think of RSCs or server components as trying to eliminate what I consider kind of a false distinction there between, like, the most successful engineers I've ever seen are ones who, when they implement a feature, they do it full stack. They don't just like whine at the back end developer to. Which I don't want to be too mean, but like that sometimes that's necessary because of the way the organization works. But like the best engineers are the ones who are empowered or have the ability to from the back end to the front end implement the entire feature. And don't the reason this doesn't happen sometimes is there's like a technological gap there, but who better to implement the back end or the front end of a feature than the person who did the other half of it? That's kind of how the front-end role at Facebook has always worked. You know, that it's not like, oh, I only write JavaScript. I'm sorry, I'm not going into that PHP file. That's just not how it really works. And obviously here with React, you're not only now using this same language and you're also using the same programming model. So I'm hoping that we can kind of eliminate a little bit of this false distinction here, which is not to say there aren't a lot of other types of engineers that do stuff on the back end, but at least when it comes to like building the application UI part, I don't think that distinction is that interesting, and hopefully this blurs the lines a lot more.
All right, let's hear from the audience. So clap if you are an aspiring or current full stack engineer. All right, yeah, there you go. Okay, cool. All right, so there, you get the griping a little bit. This is kind of a little bit of a gripe, more of a criticism, I guess. I don't know, whatever. How do these server components differ from other historical apps that ran UI on the server side? Seems like we're slingshotting back. Wait, I'm sure you've heard this argument before. What do you say?
I'll give a visual description for this phenomenon, right? So we always talk about this in technology that, we reinvented, Apache or something, right? Like we're always reinventing something that we did before. And in part, that's true. Like we do sometimes oscillate between things like this, especially in the internet space. There's servers and there's clients. And so you're going to constantly see workloads go back and forth between these two things. The way that I like to visualize it, though, is that in the early days, we were down here, right? We had very basic just server responses, Perl and PHP and stuff. And then we started doing more sophisticated things, and we discovered that certain workloads like to really be delivered statically, or dynamically, right? So first we were static, and then we went dynamic, and then we're like, oh, but Jamstack, we'll go back and be static again. And now we're talking about, well, let's move workloads back on the server, right? It's not back and forth, though. It's really like a spiral, right? So it looks like a circle from above, but if you tilt to the side, it's a spiral where we continue to discover and improve the various elements as we go up this spiral of technology. So we're always becoming more sophisticated, and even though it might feel sometimes like this slingshotting back and forth, I think every time we go back and forth, we discover something new.
It is a beautiful metaphor.
It really is, honestly, yeah.
I would also say that, like, if you think about the statement for like more than 2 seconds, and just list out all of the capabilities of the technology that we have today and compare it to like how you would build a PHP app in like 2011, it's not the same. I mean, there's a surface level pattern matching that you can go, oh, that has the same quality that I liked about building apps back in the day. But I think if you went all the way back to just slinging HTML using like a fully back-end framework, you would very quickly miss the stuff that React gives you. I think we've taken for granted how many interesting problems have been solved over the last 10 years, even when we've been in this kind of spa overreaction, perhaps. So for example, I always like to describe how a lot of the technological capabilities in React Server Components and React today, like out-of-order streaming, resource delivery that streams in. A lot of that stuff is based on things that Facebook built in 2011 in this framework called BigPipe, or this, I guess, architecture called BigPipe. It had out-of-order streaming. It had all of these things that, well, not all of them, but it had a lot of the capabilities that are really mind-blowing and eye-popping about React today. But it didn't have this ability to write the same component on the server and the client. It didn't have this ability to use the same exact programming model. It didn't have the ability to reconcile and not lose state when you do a page navigation. The high-level description of it might have been a little bit similar, but the experience of actually using it was not nearly as nice as writing something in like Next.js today.
All right. Well, I guess we have 1 minute for one last question, which is, are RSCs scalable? Today.
They're web scale.
Can we go into
sure.
prod with it today?
Well, what do you mean by scalable?
That's a great, it's that catch-all thing that people say, oh, it's not scalable.
If you scale them, then they will scale.
You can write a really big component. I've tried.
Okay.
I mean, that is the argument,
Well, I
though.
guess-
Like, the idea is that what we're all kind of building towards is you should have, I mean, it sounds a little ridiculous, but the idea is one architecture should be good enough for static sites and for dynamic sites, for teams building, like small teams building something versus a big organization like Meta building something. Obviously, there's going to be nuances, and that's not always going to be true, but I think that is the holy grail that we're pushing towards, and I think that this architecture pushes us very much in that direction.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, y'all. And a big warm round of applause for our panelists.